Hello, everyone, and welcome to Comics Talk. And I'm delighted to be joined by Pat Mills. Hi, Pat.
Hi, hi.
I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about Ragtime Soldier, what inspired you to write it, and how much of it is drawn from real history.
Okay. Um, well, it's a long journey, Phil. An incredibly long journey because um, as the centenary came up, 2014, I thought to myself, well, I should really do a follow up to Charley's War. So I put something together with an artist, David Hitchcock, and it started off being called Fred's War. And then we found that there was, this would be maybe a year before the centenary, say 2013. And so I was expecting some kind of positive reaction because Charley's War is an international bestseller. And therefore, it seemed to me a really obvious way to go. Um, but as you probably know, there's only five major publishers in the UK. I think it's about five now. So we tried Fred's War, and then I tried a different version of it uh, called Brothers in Arms, where I made the thing rather more international. And that too got sort of uh, it wasn't a rejection for all the usual reasons. If someone said, "Oh, the story's not very good," or "don't like the artwork," or something like that, you could live with those kind of things. But it wasn't anything like that at all. And so, to give you an example, I had an insider. A guy who's very, very well established in publishing. He said, "Well, why haven't you got your sequel to Charley's War? Why haven't you got it out?" And I said, "Well, I'm just meeting difficulty all the way down the line." And so he said, "Okay, well, I know someone pretty high up at, I think it was Harper Collins, but I can't be sure now." And he said, I'll ask her." And so he really pushed it and said, "Look, it's an obvious one, blah, blah, blah." And her response was, "Sorry, our list for this year is full." And so he said, "Well, what about next year?" And she said, "No, sorry, it's full for next year as well." So you get the message then. And I found that was the same reaction elsewhere. I would get these most curious reactions along the lines of, for instance, it's a great story, but it wouldn't be fair to our existing World War One authors to have this. She didn't use the words "in competition with it," but essentially that's what she meant. And I thought, well, surely in the centenary years, the more the merrier. And and so that was the kind of reaction I was getting all round. And so eventually I realized when, for example, there was Charley's War was optioned as a TV series by a major UK production company, and it wasn't proceeded with. And then I was scheduled to do a sort of in-depth account with, I think, BBC Belfast. And once again, fell through. And so eventually you get the message, especially when you see, I don't think it was me personally, but anything anti-war was essentially stifled in the centenary years. And we're still feeling the effect of it thereafter, which is why we're going in for a Kickstarter now, because if we were to go to a regular publisher for our Kickstarter for Ragtime, we would doubtless still feel the impact because just about anything that was anti-war wasn't happening. So I kept trying as a stone in my shoe. So the next thing, as you'll probably remember, was I tried to do Lion Tamer based on the life of John S. Clarke. and a famous Glaswegian, as it says here, member of Parliament, poet, lion tamer. I mean, what a story! So, as you know, we went for a kind of sort of fantasy version of it, and I remember not to do with the comic book version, but I had some. A couple of journalists from BBC Glasgow actually came down to Colchester to interview me, I think in general terms. And I said, you know, you're that John S. Clarke. And they looked at me a little warily. And then I quoted some of the incredible aspects of John S. Clarke's life. I said, you've got to do something. You know, and this would have been Radio Glasgow. So it's not some sort of huge investment, but surely to God it's worth a feature. And I'm sure if they, you know, on the ground, they would have got some wonderful stories about him because he's obviously very well remembered in Glasgow. So eventually, the story of Lion Tamer, that wasn't happening either. And I don't know. I think probably the next thing I was doing there, because I was getting incredibly frustrated because when something stalls because it's not very good, you can live with that. You can say, okay, forget it. But when you're gathering all this incredible material, and so I was gathering more and more stuff for what eventually would become Ragtime Soldier, and I thought, I've got to do something with this. And I did some non-fiction material for a computer game company. And that just whetted my appetite for more because I was just literally, you know, breathing World War I, very much as I used to do in the days of Charley's War. So I thought, okay, I've got to do something with this because I had discovered this incredible villain who features in Ragtime. This guy, Major Pollard, who, as you can see, he's a very dapper-looking chap, and it would be fair to describe him as Britain World War I James Bond, but not in a good way. I mean, James Bond today is presented as this kind of increasingly woke good guy, which of course is nowhere near the truth anyway. But certainly Pollard was very far from the good guy. And the more I read about Pollard, I thought, I've got to get him somewhere. So I started a text series, a text novel series about someone who worked for MI7, which is a relatively obscure department of the British Secret Service, where, what would you say, all the authors, all the famous authors of the day were recruited either directly or indirectly as assets for MI5. And Pollard, this guy, was at the heart of it. And this is a guy who's an incredible eccentric. So his way of entering a room, he would do this quite regularly, to the extent where I think people didn't even bother looking up. He'd fire his revolver into the ceiling. And I think he was editor of Country Life. He was a journalist at the Daily Express. I think he eventually got sacked from the Daily Express for firing his revolver into the ceiling. And so this is a very colourful, crazy character. I used him a fair bit in this text novel. And in fact, I've also used him elsewhere, even a French series I'm doing, because he's the gift that goes on giving. I can tell you as a writer that great villains are very thin on the ground. And when you come across them, you've got to make the most of them. So, I mean, he's really like Torquemada. I mean, everything I've read about him is fantastic. So So this was going on, and then eventually uh, Dundee University came along and said, "Hey, how would you like to do a story about what happened with the Black Watch at the Battle of Lewes, which was a particular tragedy." I mean, someone said because Scotland's population is so much smaller than England's, so the cost was really devastating. And as we've talked before, the impact on Dundee must have been incredible. I mean, these were guys who went over the top to the battle cry, which we feature in Ragtime Soldier. They went over the top to the battle cry of marmalade, and they're wearing gas masks because just one element of so many of inefficiency, the wind was going the wrong way, and so poison gas should never have been used. But of course, it's typical of those times, and it's that kind of anti-war element that I tend to bring into my stories. So I jumped at the chance of introducing Ragtime Soldier in this Great War Dundee publication. And as viewers will see, it's the cover is by the late great Ian Kennedy, and I think everyone recognises that style. It makes me feel quite nostalgic when I see it. There's something about Ian's work that leaves a lasting impression. It's gentle by comparison with many other war artists, but there is an enduring quality about it that it leaves an aftertaste, shall we say. So we started off with a short prologue story for introducing Ragtime Soldier in there, and we also introduced, I think, Major Pollard. Yeah, he's in there as well. And so I had this ready-made villain, and all that work that had been going on since 2013 essentially all got drawn into Ragtime Soldier, and that's where we were. So it was quite a journey, one way and another.
Yeah, I mean it's incredible to think that culminated in 2019 when we brought that publication out. And one of my favorite moments, I have to say, was when you came up to Dundee, and yourself and Ian were able to kind of get together for the first time in many years, probably since you did the Dan Dare in the New Eagle in the 1980s, which is always one of my big influences. So from a personal point of view, that was such a fantastic event. We did an event at the V&A in Dundee about ragtime and about Great War Dundee, and I do remember your talk very well, which is available on the podcast channel if anyone is interested. But at that moment, when we all got together after the talk, and I actually have a signed copy from both yourself and Ian, which I kind of cherish. Obviously, unfortunately, Ian's passed away since, but Ian's experience of war comics, in a much more traditional sense, I would say, as well, with the Commando covers. So he drew thousands of covers, and that's not an exaggeration. He did draw over, I think, coming up to 2,000 covers.
Incredible.
Yeah, I mean, there was never a drop in standard. In fact, I'm sitting just in front of me at the moment in my studio here. I actually have a page of Dan Dare, which Ian sold to me before he passed away, which is one of another cherished pieces of work. So I wonder, going forward, how does Ragtime Soldier differ from Charley's War, and in how many ways is it the same?
Well, it's definitely a successor to Charley's War. It has an advantage, which I intend to make full use of, which is what we're talking about with this Kickstarter is a total of 48 pages. So it means I can tell this very big story in one go. Whereas with Charley's War, we only had 3 pages per week. And so I couldn't risk having too many big pictures. You know, there was a sense, particularly with younger readers, that we had to have, let's say, 6 or 7 pictures on a page. And what we can do with Ragtime is one of the things I'm looking forward to is that we can have panoramas, spreads, in a way that we couldn't on Charley's War. And I know that I think Joe's artwork was incredible, but I did feel I'd restricted him, for example, on the Battle of the Somme, where you have all these soldiers go over the top. And it's one of, let's say, 6 or 7 pictures on a page. So you don't really get that vista, which we will get with Ragtime Soldier, where you'll see this whole panorama. So that's one way that it's different visually. And the other way as well is that I think all of us liked, on Charley's War, the home front scenes. And it's something that so many drama series struggle with. And actually, through Great War Dundee, through the University of Dundee, you actually came up with what I regard as a great formula, which I've never seen used anywhere else, which is, for example, Peaky Blinders. Great story, and then they want to talk about what happened in World War I, so you have very brief flashbacks. So you get some idea of what's going on, but it's arguably incomplete. And because of the way everyone at the University of Dundee approached me on it, and they said, we want to do a story about the Battle of Lewes, but we also want to show what happened in the aftermath. What about this guy's family? And I was told, to my astonishment, that in Dundee there was a balance between conscientious objectors and what you might call loyalists who had joined the Black Watch as soon as they could. And there wasn't the conflict between them that one might expect under other circumstances. And that was my first insight into how, I mean, you guys in Scotland will take this for granted, but it's how different Scotland is in its attitude to so many things. I mean, that's remarkable. It's really, I'm not sure one could say the same thing about an English city. So you've got this 2 stories going on which interlink and work dramatically. So you have the hero, Robbie McTaggart, who is at the Battle of Lewes, and then he's interacting with his family and with the central story a few years after the war, the aftermath. And with a story that is absolutely amazing, which is when Winston Churchill, who at that time, and obviously later as well, was renowned as a warmonger and as a militarist. And he was accepted as the member of Parliament for Dundee, and it was almost a done deal. But thanks to, I think, Scrimgeour and our fictional character, Robbie, and others, he gets kicked out. He gets kicked out of, and of all people, which is incredible as well, a teetotaler is elected in his place. And we assume that if he's a teetotaler, he's probably a little bit inclined towards pacifism rather than towards militarism. Who knows? And so you've got this whole story, which I think worked very well, even though as a prologue, it's I think 11 pages, something like that. But it allows us to have drama in battle and to also see the effects or the theme, whatever is being played out on the home front some years later. And I think that's a good thing, because some of my favourite episodes of Charley's War are when he's on the home front, and I would always be thinking to myself, yeah, I better get him back to the trenches soon, because otherwise the more action orientated readers are going to say, well, do we really want to see that, his mum and dad and his fiance and he gets married, which are all normal things that happen to all of us, And so Ragtime Soldier provides a much more satisfying structure to things, where you haven't got to say, as Peaky Blinders does, oh, war was hell, that's why I'm taking drugs now. I mean, that's the theme of quite a number of episodes. And so I was able to explore all those things, which I think makes for an elegant storytelling, and I think really gives the artists, yourself and Gary, a chance to really breathe on this, So you're not all the time crammed into 6 or 7 pictures on a page kind of thing. So I'm very, very positive about the way we're going forward on this.
Yeah, I think from an art point of view, we obviously are heavily influenced by Joe's work on Charley's War. But like you say, because of the compressed nature of the storytelling and the weekly regime of getting that out, there's a lot of panels on the page. British comics in general, until 2000 AD came on, which you obviously know because you instigated this kind of blowing up of, panels and making them more dynamic. But, Battle was still kind of stuck in a fairly traditional format, which
Yeah.
kind of meant that, sometimes you were getting, 11, 12 panels on a page, which is incredibly dense. So myself and Gary are lucky that in this run we're expanding that out a little bit. It gives us more room to maneuver and maybe make the pages a little bit more dynamic. That is not a dig at Joe's work, by the way. He was just constrained by the format of the time. I'm pretty sure if he was given the same room to breathe, then he would deliver astounding work like he always did. I'm a huge fan of Joe's work. I think what's quite interesting, though, again, and again, touch upon the background of it, and obviously I do know a bit about the background, but for the benefit of our listeners and viewers, just maybe touch upon that ragtime element, because I found that fascinating. It wasn't an angle that I was expecting when I originally saw the script. So do you maybe want to talk about where that came from?
Well, it opens up an awful lot of aspects of World War One, which have been deliberately ignored by historians, and I would say social historians as well. And it comes down to the fact that they had this, it's described as a marching song. Although I'm trying to imagine singing this as they marched, but there was this incredible song, which was obviously a standard in the British Army, and that would have included the Black Watch and just everywhere across the British Empire. And just to preface it by saying that Fred Karno was the impresario who introduced Charlie Chaplin, and I don't know if he had anything to do with Laurel and Hardy, but he was really famous as perhaps the Simon Cowell of his day or whatever. He was a star maker. So if you bear that in mind with the song that the British soldiers sang, which was, "We are Fred Karno's army, the ragtime infantry. We cannot fight, we cannot shoot, what bleeding use are we? And when we get to Berlin, the Kaiser, he will say, Hock, hock, mein Gott, what a bloody fine lot are the ragtime infantry." So now you have to also bear in mind, this was actually sung to a hymn, the Church as One Foundation, uh, which I'm not sure if that's the same hymn as Onward Christian Soldiers, but it's certainly, because I'm a card-carrying pagan, but I think I think the Church as One Foundation is rather more solemn than Onward Christian Soldiers. Anyway, so this is the song that the British soldiers are singing. And this is what I mean by social historians ignoring this, because it's fundamental. It's one of the key marching songs. It's one of the key songs that they would have sung. That's why it's... So what this means is that ragtime meant a great deal to them. And I've yet to come across any historian even say, well, what was all that about? But obviously, this was very important to them. And we can get a little more into ragtime in a moment, but this was long before ragtime music came to Britain in approximately 1918 with Harlem Hellfighters and James Europe, which was more moving towards jazz anyway. So I had to ask myself questions like, well, where does this come from? Why do they keep referring to themselves as the ragtime infantry? And I'll get on to that in a moment, but what first struck me about it was it's so Monty Python. You know, we cannot fight, we cannot shoot, what bleeding use are we? And, you know, you could almost imagine the Monty Python crew actually doing this particular song. And of course, it's not unique. There's lots of Python-esque humor in the trenches. And that leads me on to another thing as well. It wasn't middle-class humor. It wasn't working-class humor. It was everybody's humor. And we all know this as, you know, being part of the United Kingdom, that sort of self-deprecating, taking the piss out of yourself is very much it's very much the British character. You couldn't imagine some other European countries singing anything remotely like this. They take themselves far too seriously. So I really felt a pang whenever I sort of hear this song or I read the lyrics, because it means you can identify with these people. And what it also means as well is that ragtime was around from very early on, not 1918, that whole thing about the States bringing jazz over. Yes, that's true, but it was around earlier. Now, there's absolutely no anything I can find, at least, and I've really researched this quite heavily. So I've reached conclusions which I believe are correct, which is that sheet music was the vinyl of its day. So if you were, let's say you're 17 or 18. Now, most houses, or a lot of houses, had pianos in them. You know, these days it's relatively rare, or you've got an electronic keyboard or something. But you know, it's very much an image of our grandfathers, our great-grandfathers, that you have the piano. And so sheet music would have been the thing. And every time there was new sheet music, it would have had the same excitement that, say, for my generation and maybe the one after it had for Top of the Pops, for example, things like that. So you think, wow, this. So I think it's fair to reconstruct it on those terms. And so what they were saying really was, we're rock and roll, we're cool, you know, we're ragtime, but we're rock and roll. And it makes a connection with all these guys, our forefathers, our great-grandfathers, that you don't get from the way that they are often represented in history books. I mean, to a degree, photography is against us, because the minute you see these brown images, you know, these brown photographs, and invariably, because of the limitations of technology in those days, they're not often caught with spontaneous images. So they're often tend to be rather formal, very stiff. But suddenly you realize these guys weren't like that at all. And, you know, I've checked out various other things, particularly the role of theatre in the Great War, because soldiers, there were concert parties, which were very, very Monty Python.
I'm really interested in those satirical elements. Would you be able to elaborate on that a bit, Pat?
Absolutely, because I think it says something really important about bringing these ordinary soldiers to life rather than the simplified cannon fodder image that they are often represented. So the school I went to, which was, you know, fairly posh, and what the history teacher, and I remember him well, saying, and a classmate reminded me of this. He said that this is what he said to my classmates' class, and if he'd said it in mine, I would have probably taken real umbrage. He said that World War One Tommies were all too dim to be witty enough to call Ypres wipers. And the officers would have made up all the clever and amusing stuff. Now that is just so wretched to just dismiss. And all the evidence is actually to the contrary. But it highlights the fact that there is, and it's not being paranoid, it goes all the way back to when I was first writing Charley's War. There is a snobbery about the way that World War One is represented, and a sense that somehow the officer class are the witty, funny, clever ones. And if you're a World War One history buff, you'll probably know that there was actually the Wipers Times, which was written by officers and recently dramatized by yet another member of the elite, Ian Hislop, ex-Bullingdon boy and a rather more dubious Oxford club. And the Wipers Times actually was incredibly boring. It's officer humor. It's just not effing funny. Whereas the example I've given you of the Ragtime Tree is funny, it's slapstick, it's alive. And this attitude permeates, and these are the people who control publishing, remember. These are the people who said, no, we don't want to do Fred's War because we haven't got room on our list this year and it might affect another World War One writer, etc., etc. So this isn't just some kind of minor paranoia. There's a famous cartoon in Punch by Reading, which I can't find, and I've often related it in Charley's War, where there's two soldiers going over the top, and one says to the other, I shouldn't really be here. I don't write poetry. And, you know, it's funny, but it also makes a point that World War One tends to be remembered for some very evocative poetry, but the ordinary soldiers are, and their comedy, their life, the music they love, like ragtime, is all just like, well, that's not really interesting. And I'll give you another example of this. I had a next door neighbor at that time who was a Cambridge Don. And I said to him, these letters home that soldiers, you know, write to their loved ones, and sometimes they're grammatically all over the place, but they are so emotional. And when you read them, they often bring tears to your eyes. And I said, now, if the definition of poetry is emotion, surely these should be included in the curriculums, where you have students today study World War One poetry, all of which is excellent, but is, with some exceptions, generally written by the elite, like Sassoon, who came from I think probably the wealthiest family in the UK, which was why he was never court-martialed and shot for his sedition, because they couldn't do that. So they just did the Soviet solution and stuck him in a lunatic asylum. And so I said to this Cambridge Don, why isn't this included? And he's saying, well, no, it can't be. He said, because it's not intended as poetry. So the mark of poetry, apparently, is that it has to be written with the intent to be a poem. Now, I think that's a bit unlikely. It's just a polite way of saying he's not part of our club. These working class soldiers are not part of our club, so they have to know their place. So all this class consciousness, which I've obviously covered quite fulsomely in Charley, there's still elements of it there in Ragtime Soldier, not least the ragtime music itself, because again, I had to look up and think, well, what was the reaction? Why was ragtime so popular? Now, the trouble is, if you listen to it on YouTube, so many of the, what would they be called, phonographs, I think in those days or whatever, they're so scratched and crackly. I mean, it does give them a certain character, but you've really got to pick the right ones. And often, just like today, surprise, surprise, often the raunchiest ragtimes music was kind of cleaned up, and there were some who were socially acceptable, like Scott Joplin, and others who were not. So, if you're looking at ragtime, you might think, well, what was all the fuss? But the primary thing was, of course, it was hot, it was sexy, and these young soldiers' parents hated it because it was black music, and it was also, it led to dancers like the Grizzly Bear, which I've yet to find a video of it. But a Grizzly Bear was some pretty close-up hip swinging, right? So close, in fact, that the Vatican banned the Grizzly Bear. And eventually all these things got cleaned up. And so I think the indirect ancestor of the Grizzly Bear is the foxtrot, which is no problem to anyone. So you can see with all these things that there's this generation of young men, teenagers, who what they would have been, if they're, say, 18 or 19, they're probably just like any other 18 or 19-year-old kids. And what they would be talking about in the trenches would often be, what's the latest sheet music? Have you heard this one? This is amazing, and so they'd be thinking about music and so on. But if you look at the generally the social histories of the Great War, I'm not aware of anyone who really focuses on this. It's like, well, that doesn't matter. Their role was to do and die, and we don't really care what they were thinking about. So that's that kind of energy that's in Ragtime Soldier that's very important, I think. So we can remember them, and we can cross that bridge of time with them. So that's what lies behind it.
Great. So, I mean, you've always kind of championed that kind of focus on experience and ordinary people in extraordinary situations. And it's safe to say that about your science fiction work as well. Where there's a subtext. There's always a subtext. Which I think is always shines through in your work.
Yeah.
Um, how do you think that Ragtime Soldier taps into that kind of story of ordinary people, and how important is that it's authentic?
Well, it has to be authentic, and it has to deal with things that um, are very real for them. And now I thought at the time when I completed Charley's War, I really thought, well, I've covered most of the subjects, I've read all the things and so forth, and I wasn't aware that there were new waves of research which are still going on today, which are still revealing new aspects. And one of them is the fact that cocaine was given to the ordinary soldiers in the trenches, certainly on a trench raid. I mean, because in a trench raid, you're going to be up close and personal with a German soldier, and you've got to kill them. And so I wanted to capture that look with, and Gary and yourself, of course, have captured it beautifully, because this is what I was saying in the text, that they were given a drug called forced march, which was cocaine and caffeine, and it was probably, according to various experts I've looked at, probably given to them in their rum ration, with or without their knowledge. It's hard to know. And the relevance of it is, it's of course it's even more of an issue today. I see there's a film out, I think it's on March the 7th, called Marching Powder, which covers that very, very same subject. Now, why they've said marching powder, I assume is, although it's not a military film, it's about a guy who takes cocaine and various other drugs. But I assume that somehow it gave him that burner, that energy, etc., etc. So they would have been given this drug on trench raids, and possibly on going over the top at key battles. The thing is, it's completely hidden, and it's a Dutch author who discovered just how relevant it was. And of course, the whole thing with any addiction is that it leaves an aftermath. Some people will be fine; they'll get away, they'll walk away, and so on. But after World War One, there were hundreds, I would say probably thousands, of addicted soldiers. And they would break into pharmacies and things like that. And of course, not just British soldiers, but similar drugs were given to the French and similar to the Germans. And so you had this legacy after the war. And whereas today we have some sense of what an addiction can do and how to deal with it and so forth, I think the attitude at that time was probably to just hide it all away. And I think that's why Peaky Blinders is to be commended, because as you'll know, the series features not just one cocaine addict, Arthur Shelby, but everybody's at it. And there's a forthcoming TV drama series called Dope Girls, which also explores this. And so the relevance of this is that drugs back then were as much part of their lives as as music was. You know, it's not something. The image is always to get away from these things and to say, oh well, that never happened, or if we don't talk about it, no one will think about it. But it is actually incredibly important, because I did some research on this issue for another project, and I discovered that pre-World War One, an awful lot of ordinary working class people were on what would now be called Class A drugs, which they got over the counter. You know, you got opium poppies, you had opiate drugs like Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, which was given to children. And so J. Collis Brown, in its earlier form, I think included cannabis and possibly morphine and so on. So this was a real issue. And of course, it's always ignored. And once again, it tends to be an elitist thing. So, you know, you might hear of, oh, the bright young things, a kind of Stephen Fry thing, where the elite were taking there's one famous account about jolly old chlorers, referring to chloroform. So chloroform, ether, you name it, all sorts of, but it was always right. It was the bright young things. It was the, you know, the flappers of the 1920s. Not true, not true. It was across the whole board. And what would happen if you happen to be a working class girl, certainly in Cardiff, and you wanted to get your hands on drugs, then you would, in one instance, they would go to Chinese laundry, because drugs were available there. And so there was a problem, and it's just been ignored, or it's been overshadowed by, yes, well, there were amphetamines in World War II, so what? It was a big problem. And the historian's attitude is, well, it's not a big problem if we ignore it, because we don't want that to tarnish our forefathers' memories. Well, I don't want to tarnish it. What I want to show is what they had to put up with, what they went through, and how many of them, not all of them, but some of them would have been casualties of it. So I think it's remarkable that actually that comics have to do what books and newspapers don't do. You know, in other words, tell the truth rather than some BS version of it.
I think that's really interesting. You touched upon it at the start of the interview about the kind of liberation of Kickstarter, I suppose. And obviously, it was around when we did the first prologue and we did Great War Dundee, but that was born out of a research project, which is interesting in of itself, I think. But do you think that the Kickstarter format in particular, or crowdfunding, kind of enables creators to have more of a voice?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, I mean, how else would we get this away? It would be very difficult. One could get some kind of sponsorship, perhaps, to go forward, but the controversial nature where you are actually showing soldiers suffering from the effects of a named drug from a named drug company, I could see that running into problems. I was just actually reflecting whether I could have gotten away with this in Charley's War, and I guess the usual answer is no. But I was actually quite crafty. I could often get away with things in Charley's War because I'd sort of sneak them in a bit at a time, and so I don't know. But yeah, Kickstarter is I think there's always a way for creative freedom to be unleashed, and it tends to be very much at this base level, at street level, rather than anywhere else, because I just quoted you those numerous examples where no, the Great War has to be represented as masterpieces of anti-war poetry or whatever it is, and so all these ordinary soldiers, their lives are somehow second best. When they're funny, they're poetic in their own way, and above all, they're very, very human, and that needs celebrating.
Yeah, I think that's something that even when I was reading Charlie's War as a kid, I could tell that it was different because it wasn't a traditional war story. Even at a young age, I could tell that. I just wonder how you kind of got away with it, to be honest. Looking back on it, because obviously you're working for quite a big publisher, quite a hierarchy there, of kind of editorial. Um, and I know you had kind of sympathetic editors anyway, certainly at the start of the process. But do you think that later on maybe they took the eye off the ball a little bit?
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. I mean, the big thing that really helped it was, and this is a remarkable thing, and I think it's something that you, the battle readers, especially on this 50th anniversary, need commending for was this was the number one story in battle. This was the top story, not just for 1 week or 1 month, but year in, year out during its run. And what this says to me is that young readers, well, let me put it a little crudely, they have better taste than a lot of adults. Do you know what I mean? They knew there was something special happening here, and they knew it was real, and so they went for it. And that's really remarkable. But yeah, the powers that be did not like it, and I actually put that to the test. Um, and I think after a while, for a while, because it was so popular, it was like, oh well, we'll put up with it. But then they realized it was actually challenging the tired, cliched rules of comics. And what it meant was, well, if this story is number one, and this is what kids want to read, well, what does that tell you? That you've got to really start giving uh, readers stories that are really going to make them think. And there was always this dismissive attitude towards comics. So yeah, I think Charlie's War really stirred them up, and I could think of several examples where that happened. And so yeah, it was controversial, and the one I've often talked about is where I featured racism, and that was the one and only time where they really came down hard on me and said, we don't want to offend people here, because I was featuring white American racists from the Ku Klux Klan. So it's like, why shouldn't I offend the Ku Klux Klan? But it was like, oh no, that's too controversial. I mean, what are we talking? 1980s? I mean, it's not like it's a lifetime ago, for God's sake. So yeah, that. But what I always had to say to myself was, I had to be pragmatic, which doesn't come easily to me. I had to keep a low profile on that because I knew that the British invasion of Russia was coming up. And as most people didn't even know that Britain invaded Russia in 1919, I thought, okay, if I make too much of a fuss about this racism here, they're going to start. They'll come back on me on another story. So I sort of bit the bullet on it, but I wasn't happy.
I think that'll lead us quite nicely into the 50th anniversary, actually, of Battle. We're actually hopefully putting this out on the actual anniversary of the first issue. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the genesis of Battle.
Um, well, Battle really, well, obviously it was um, Warlord had been this huge hit, this incredible hit, and um, I think it may have sold something like 1 million copies on issue 1. I mean, it was phenomenal. So IPC, their rivals, thought, right, we've got to do something like Warlord, and who do we get? And there was no one. There was just freelancers like myself and John Wagner, who had the what you might call the wherewithal to do it. And well, we were a little. I think we were both a little resistant to it to start with. I mean, after all, we were products of the '60s, so we weren't that enthusiastic about having a kind of war comic per se. But I think we progressively found ways to subvert the system. And to start with, we followed Warlord's pattern. But I think we increasingly realized that Warlord itself was hamstrung by what you might call the DC Thompson restrictions on it. So, for example, the primary character, Warlord, he's an aristocrat. He's a kind of Scarlet Pimpernel who pretends to be a coward, where actually he's doing all these daring deeds, which is real establishment stuff. And, you know, okay, it was all right in its time, but Scarlet Pimpernel was what? I don't know, 1910 or something. So, you know, its time was over, for God's sake. So we started using DC Thompson writers, and we progressively realized that we had to either write stuff ourselves or draw on Jerry Finley Day as a primary writer, or find complete unknowns, because the DC Thompson format could be very, very restricting. And so eventually, I think we overshadowed Warlord. But I remember talking to the editor of Warlord, and I think later Bullet, and he said, if we'd had the freedom that you guys had, we'd have wiped the floor with you. Well, I dispute that, but I think it would have been a good battle between the two of us as to who would have won out. But of course, it's hypothetical, because the poor guy, he just didn't have that creative freedom. He had, for example, in Warlord, you had, if memory serves, The Wolf of Kabul, which, you know, with Cricky Bar and all this kind of stuff, serving on the northwest frontier. So it's very much an imperialist story. And I think kids were progressively looking for something fresh and new. And, well, we got some of Battle right. We got some of it wrong, but we eventually got it together, and I think, and we were so well served with having such a brilliant editor as Dave Hunt, who kind of kept us on the straight and narrow as well. So it's very much a success story, I think.
That leads us to, again, how Charley's War actually came about. I just wonder how you approached pitching that to the editor, to Dave Hunt, and how you ended up working with Joe on the art.
Well, as I said before, I think Dave really deserves some kind of comic medal for doing the unthinkable, because comic editors, let's face it, they're a sad lot for the most part. And, you know, they don't take chances. They don't take a leap into the unknown. And what Dave was saying was, if you go for this World War I story you're thinking about, you can have Joe Cahoon as your artist. Now, Joe was busily drawing Johnny Red, which was incredibly successful. I think it was probably the #1 story in Battle at that time. So to take him off that story and put him on an unknown story like Charlie's War, that's an incredibly courageous thing to do. And there ain't one editor out there who has that kind of guts. So I endlessly bang the drum for Dave there, because if Charlie's War had been drawn by anyone else at that time, there's probably a couple of other artists who might just have swung it, but never like Joe. I think that's what we would all agree on. And so why did I do it? World War One had been ignored, primarily because the general point of view, which I held to alongside just about everyone else, was, well, there's no action in it. You know what I mean? Or there's very little action. And then it's really depressing when it does happen. And so how much drama can you get out of the trenches? Those were the kind of conversations that we probably, all of us had from time to time on World War One. So we would tend to go in more for the kind of Lawrence of Arabia type World War One stories. But I had a background of a great interest in World War One because I'd seen the film Oh, What a Lovely War, and I'd seen the stage production as well, and I'd seen them both when I was in my late teens. And as I said before, it was my sound of music. You know what I mean? It was. I think I went and saw the film maybe, I would say probably at least 6 times, which I still find hard to believe, but I do have that memory of seeing it again and again and again, you know? And so I obviously I was really connecting with the Great War. And I think because it showed that there was another side, not just to warfare, but to the whole class war and to I mean, here were these, you know, okay, it came out in the 60s, but this was this really evocative example of where the ruling class was shown up as either the idiots or the butchers that they really were, or in fact, I would say more cynically, calculated murderers now, rather than stubborn idiot butchers. I think they knew what they were doing. They weren't quite as dumb as they're even projected in Oh, What a Lovely War. And so that really inspired me. I mean, as a film, it hasn't aged well, I don't think. But the songs haven't aged at all. They're still as powerful as ever. And of course, it was shown in a centenary back at East End of London, where Joan Littlewood first put it together. And I went to see it there, the stage play, and it was 50% at least of the audience were under 25, I would say. So that was really good to see that, because part of the censorship of World War One was to say, Oh, What a Lovely War was about the Vietnam War. It's for old hippies or something like that. And no, it wasn't at all. It certainly wasn't when I was watching it. I never thought about Vietnam or anything like that. And as I say, in the centenary year, so we're probably talking, probably in 2014, I suppose, the audiences were packed, and they were predominantly younger people. So that, if you like, was inspiring me even before I started on Charlie's War. And then, of course, I read everything on the subject. I thought, my God, how am I going to make this work? You know, because and I knew I had to change the way I wrote. And in simplified terms, I had to write to a higher standard. Because if you're writing a typical World War II comic story, you can have just lots of action, bit of superficial characterization, and that's how so often war comics are written. But Charlie's War had to be different. The characters had to be real, and so I've taken that away from from Charley, and it's still there with Ragtime Soldier. In fact, in some ways, even more so because Charley's War is in a kind of anonymous, either East London or South London regiment that's not really, hasn't got any strong identity. But as you know, with Ragtime Soldier, we're talking about Dundee and we're talking about the Black Watch. And so we can really make this authentic. We can take the authenticity to another level. And I think that will still pay off even more over time.
So the success of Charlie's War has meant it's been republished numerous times in different formats and different languages. Do you want to talk about that reach that Charlie's War still has?
Yeah, I mean, the French one is the most well known, I think. So what you see here is quite interesting because the publisher went in for colourful covers. And I think, well, I know that really appealed to kids. Those, whereas, for example, if you look at, for instance, if you compare the Titan edition, it's a beautiful edition, but it's not going to appeal to 12-year-old kids the same way. And I found this when I was doing a signing for the French edition of Charlie's War, which possibly has outsold the British edition, possibly. And I would see 12-year-old kids come over and they'd see these colourful covers and they'd sort of flick through and then they'd go off and then they'd come back with some money they got from their dad and buy the copies. And I think that's one of the things I really like. That obviously I'm endeavouring to do the same thing with Ragtime Soldier because, for example, my father-in-law, we once bought him a DVD of It Happened Here, which features the Nazi occupation of Britain. And he was outraged. He said, no, we would never surrender to the Nazis, this kind of stuff. And so I wasn't sure what his reaction would be to Charlie's War, but he liked Charlie's War because I think the message was rather less in your face. It Happened Here is a really brilliant film, but the message is really, really hard on. And so he liked Charlie's War, and I think he was only vaguely aware of just how much subversion I was pumping into the story. So that's very much the way that I hope to go with Ragtime Soldier as well, because we've got all that richness of the Dundee landscape, and with all you guys from Dundee as a kind of Scottish creative team, it's absolutely amazing, you know. So, just to digress on this for a moment, with the few pages of Ragtime that we did thus far, we got the Dundee accent right, and the late Ian Kennedy went over it and made it even more accurate. So it's
I actually have the copy.
Precise.
I have the copy here, and I remember showing the script to Ian, and then he said, "Could I have a look at the script?" Yeah, and he took it away, and the next time I went up, he in pencil marked it up, and I'm not gonna lie, Pat, I was really scared to send that to you. I was a bit like, do we go there or not? But I do remember your reaction when I sent it was like, this is amazing, you know, this is great, you know. So thanks to Paul Trimble, by the way, for saving this, because basically I do have a copy somewhere, but basically when I was over at OMA Comic Festival in 2019, I actually had this with me, and Paul Trimble took a photocopy of it, and he actually sent me the photocopy just a few weeks ago when he saw that Ragtime Soldier was coming back. But that was an amazing moment, I think, of again that authenticity coming through to the dialogue as
Yeah.
well. And this time round,
Oh no,
unfortunately,
I think it's really, really, it's really important, and I try to. Well, I'm hoping to bring in, and this is where it will make this. It will soften the edges of the story, if you like, a little bit with some other aspects of Scottish culture, or like McGonagall, you know, and so all those kind of things, I think, can come into it and make the characters richer. I mean, one has to strike a balance, I think, somewhere down the line for the very English audiences who might say, this is too Robbie Burns for me, or whatever. But no, I think we can get that balance, and but it's also, of course, that you realise it is just one notch down from officially being another language, and of course, as all languages have their own way of expressing things that are different to the source language. So, you know, that's something else I'd like to explore in the fullness of time, even down to the motto, Scotland's motto, which is also the motto of the Black Watch. I'm not going to attempt to remember it now, because it was in Latin. But essentially, it was, "Don't mess with me."
that sounds about right.
Or there will be consequences.
Yeah, that sounds about right. I mean, the interesting aspect to this, though, I think, is that obviously you spent some time in Dundee, you know, when you worked at DC Thompson's, which I think is a really interesting insight. So you do have some first-hand knowledge. It's not like you're just sitting there kind of making this stuff up. You know, you actually were lived in the city and
Yeah.
probably experienced some of that.
Well,
That you
I
know,
have absolutely, and I have another ulterior motive, which is just really by the by. But I took one of these DNA tests. What was it, about 3 years ago, something like that, and discovered that although the official story was 50% Irish and the other 50% English, not the case. It's more like, offhand, more like 35% Scottish, and then the remaining part of that 50, maybe Midlands rather than Southern England. But anyway, the 35% is pretty solidly around Glasgow, so I'm quite chuffed about that. You know? Yeah, so it gives me a further. So I think I can truthfully say that, you know, it's a kind of all Scottish team, really, one way and another. So that's good.
I mean, we do have this time around. We
Certainly
do
an
have.
all Celtic.
I mean, we do have this time around. Matthew Fitt is going to look over the script because he is a Scots language expert. But he already has spoken to me about it and said we do need to make sure that it is understandable, you know, out with, you know,
Yes.
as well, which is what we're striving to do to make it as accessible and readable as possible. So Matthew's got great experience of doing this. He worked on a
Absolutely.
lot of big brands, big names. You know, he's translated Harry Potter into Scots. He's done Tintin, Asterix, all these big name things.
Really? Wow.
He actually worked with Cam Kennedy back in the day and Alan Grant when he translated Kidnapped into Scots as part of a big UNESCO funded project which Cam illustrated and Alan wrote. So Matthew's got quite a lot of experience doing this in different formats and particularly in comics. And the interesting thing is that the art team is Gary Welsh and myself, and Gary has done quite a lot of work with Matthew over the last few years, working on Scots language comics. There's a particularly good one about Tam O'Shanter, which I think is definitely worth downloading. You could download that for free, and I'll put some links in the show notes as well, so people could pick up on that. But it just gives us another angle to explore, I think, and it's an interesting one about that language and that kind of that kind of real life dialogue, which in some comics just isn't present.
No, and as I say, because we're actually drawing on a city and we're all associated with it in one form or another, and you know the city is familiar to me, but that aside, the fact that their battle cry, the Battle of Luz, which is heartbreaking as well as funny, is marmalade, because that whole thing of jute, jam, and journalism being the three cornerstones of Dundee, and so I can connect with all that and the the jute factories and so forth. It's a very rich background, and also in particular, I think the unique identity of Dundee, which was really highlighted on that first story in here, where this prologue, where we covered an awful lot of things, but it's the unique identity, conscientious objectors, and quote unquote patriots being side by side with one another. And what that meant for families and so forth was very, very interesting. So I'm looking forward to exploring that. And it's different to Glasgow. So, for instance, when I was researching the major story for Ragtime Soldier, I found that Glasgow gangs, of course, there's so many of them, they're so colourful, and they were all around at the time, the Billy Boys and the Norman Conks and so forth. But when it came to Dundee gangs, they must have been relatively obscure, because there's no historical record that I can find. I know we have an expert that we can call on, and he will probably correct me on this, but they were quite small scale by comparison with Glasgow or even Edinburgh. So I've tried to get these things correct, and even down to Chinese laundries, because I'd assumed that drugs were quite prevalent in Dundee, and I assumed that it would be via Chinese laundries. And I thought, well, I'd better check. And to my surprise, there were no Chinese laundries in Dundee, whereas Cardiff, where I'd sort of got all this information from, there were quite a few. So, I really try and check my facts. And I think, is it Billy?
Yeah.
And I must look up his book on the historical side as well, because I want to make it very, very authentic, and of course also taking into account that the physical geography of Dundee has changed. So you've got, but your city centre, there's still, I think from what I remember on my last visit, I think it's still essentially there. That sort of what we would say in England, the high street. I'm not sure what you called it in.
No, that's right. Yeah, the high street.
Dundee.
Yeah, it's the high street. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And that actually leads me to an interesting point. So we had a discussion late last year, and it was like getting the band back together a little bit. So Chris Murray from the University of Dundee came along to that, who acted as co-editor with me in the original Great War Dundee publication. And I thought it was an interesting chat that you had, particularly about some of the elements of the new segment of the story. And maybe you could just
Yeah.
talk a little bit about that without giving any spoilers away.
Oh, absolutely. Well, Chris came up with a couple of things which I've used both in the story. And I don't think it takes away, it's a spoiler. First of all, something that I think, he said it in a very matter-of-fact sort of way, but coming from an English culture, it really stood out to me. I thought, they wouldn't have that in England. And the particular thing was a cartoon strip in D.C. Thompson's, of all people, which predated World War One. Was it something like Kusti and the Kunzel?
Kirsty from the
Forgive my
Kunsel,
pronunciation there. Yeah, and so this. I mean, so when he described it, I was like, that feels weird. And when I looked it up, and I actually found one or two of these cartoons, I thought this would never fly in England, the culture that I knew anyway, because it was so challenging authority. There's this formidable woman who goes up the council and says, you've got this, the stairs are the wrong shape and size, and she's constantly complaining, and they don't throw her out, So that, again, is something that's quite Dundonian, I thought. And so I was very pleased to, because obviously she would be a character that the Black Watch soldiers would know. It'd be a bit like a Giles cartoon or Andy Cap or whoever. So that was one aspect. And then the other thing he pointed out was the silent cinema and the fact that I believe Scott Dundee has a disproportionate number of cinemas at that time. I don't know how that I mean, people always usually say, "Oh, this city or that town or other had a lot of pubs." It's a classic one in Ireland, for example. You say, "Oh, you walk down the Irish high street in this town, and there's 15 pubs or something." But Dundee apparently had an astonishing number of cinemas, and Chris pointed out the very famous film, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which I think was probably on about its third remake in 1922 or 23, when so our hero, the Ragtime Soldier, I mean, he's also a ragtime piano player, so he's eking out an existence playing the piano in one of these these silent movies. And I'd watched, and I must watch the whole thing through, Jekyll and Hyde, and I can see how it must have really affected the soldiers at the time, because I mean, we tend to be a little dismissive of silent movies now because we're so used to, sort of high definition and whatever is beyond HD. But silent movies would have been incredibly effective. I mean, that's why there were so many cinemas, and people were saying, "Hey, we've got to go to the flicks." And I think the fact that it's by originally by a Scottish author as well adds a certain poignancy to it as well. So it's working all those factors in, and of course, the thing I'm looking forward to, which is why I really hope this Kickstarter comes together, because I know what I'm like. I will spend hours working out which is the right cinema. I'll check with Chris, but also it's like, well, if it was positioned here and the pub they went to was over here, and it would take them, let's say, 15 minutes to walk between the two. And of course, with Google Maps, you've got all those details. I find that sort of thing is, well, it's very prevalent in novels. It's not so commonplace in comic books in the UK. And that's no real criticism of British comic creators. It's simply they don't get paid the right amount of money so they think, if I research this bit, it's going to cost me an hour or 2 hours of my time. And so that's where corners get cut. But I've never been very good at cutting corners, and so I should be avidly working out now. If Robbie was playing piano at this cinema, and his mum was working in the jute factory over, let's say, in Lochie Road somewhere, and so on and so on, and it makes it very real. Actually, I remember I did do the same thing with Charley with Silvertown. Because there was this huge explosion. His mum was working in a munitions factory, and he has to get there and get her out before there's another devastating. Because it was really like uh, almost like the bombing of Dresden or something, when Silvertown completely exploded, and the loss of life was colossal. But I remember working out which road he was on, and where the factory was likely to be. And these things do make a difference to readers. That's the thing that's really satisfying. They don't necessarily know why it feels right, but they know that the author has done his homework. And that of course, is also reflected in the art, because, you and Gary know where these places are. I mean, especially yourself. You were telling me featuring Robbie's younger brother, because I wanted someone. I come across this thing of which said how in Scotland they go in for this New Year's dip in the Tay, and I was talking to Lisa about this, and I was saying I bet they did that in World War I era as well. And she said, no, that's got to be something. It's an age of central heating and so on. I said, no, I think the Scots are always that way inclined. Speaking as an English wuss, and lo and behold, you said that it's a commonplace thing which goes back a long, long time.
Yep.
To take a dive in the.
I know,
So it's
exactly.
those kind of details. That's what makes the story rich, and those are the kind of details that often there isn't space for in a war story, and that's why I think we have something special with Ragtime Soldier, in as much as we can show all the action, all the comradeship, all the pathos of the trenches, but we can connect it to real life people, and where they came from, because we all come from somewhere, and we're all going back to wherever it is we came from, or most of us hope to. And so I think it's as a dramatic system, I haven't seen it anywhere else. I'm sure there's obviously the odd film or novel that covers it, but thinking of things like Peaky Blinders, and or going back quite a way, when the boat comes in, it's rare to have that home front stuff. So you actually start to get to know the family, and inevitably the family is going to have a huge impact on people. You're going to go back to the trenches in a good state of mind or a bad state of mind, because you've fallen out with your girlfriend or your mom or your dad or whoever it is. So it's a very rich vein to tap into, I think.
It's funny you mentioned that part about that kind of geography, I suppose, of a city, and you've reminded me of, Dundee hasn't featured very often on TV shows, but I do remember, I think it was in the 90s, it could have even been the late 1980s. There was a three-parter called Jute City, and it was really well done. But there was a scene where John Sessions was one of the main characters in it, who was from Whose Lines It Anyway, he's most famous for that. But he was one of the actors, and there's a scene where they're driving around Dundee city centre in a car. And for anyone who's from Dundee, you're watching this scene going, that you couldn't possibly have done that route, by looking at what's happening outside the car and tracing it. So people from Dundee watched it and went, oh, that's not authentic, because you couldn't get from that part of the city to there in like the space and time it would take to drive around, you know. So you're absolutely spot on about that, and it's a bugbear of mine. You see it a lot in TV productions where they're playing about with the locations just to suit the production work, there's a disconnect there sometimes if you know the city. The same thing
Yeah,
happens in Glasgow
I
as well.
found that with. Oh yeah, I mean Glasgow would be a prime target for it, wouldn't it? But I also thinking of the television series Succession, where I've forgotten the name of the actor, but the
Brian Cox.
CEO, the
Yeah.
guy who's on. Yeah, and so they go back to Dundee, and as I was watching, I was thinking that doesn't feel quite right to me. Where's, it felt like some sort of suburb of Dundee that I personally don't remember. Obviously, it exists, but it didn't feel like I mean, the brilliant writers, but it didn't feel like they'd really spent that much time thinking about Dundee. Even though I think Brian Cox may well have come from Dundee.
Yeah, he's from Dundee, and it was
But
his idea. It was actually his idea to film that whole sequence in Dundee. And I do have a funny personal story about that. I have to just tell you this one before we run out of time. But I actually got a phone call in my previous job, which was running an animation visual effects course at the university, and I got a phone call one day, a random phone call from someone from HBO. I thought that's a bit strange, you know. And they were asking me, "Do you have post-production facilities in the university?" Because obviously we had this course, and I was like, "Well, we do, but I don't think we're up for the a kind of Hollywood TV series sort of production level." So I had to actually turn them away, and they ended up doing the post-production work in London.
oh,
So it was a really sad day. And ironically, just a couple of weeks ago, we've just opened up a film and TV studio, a virtual production studio in Dundee. We'd have been able to do it now. So there you go. That's my story about Succession and filming in Dundee. So
it's great. It's great that Dundee is really going to be on the cinema and television map with really authentic technology and everything to go with it. Yeah, that's really good.
maybe we're harking
Yeah,
back to those old
it's
days.
yeah. I mean, who knows? I mean, that's another thing I think with that whole culture that comes across. The assumption usually is, oh, it was a very long time ago, and they didn't know as much. They didn't think as much. There's a sense that somehow we've moved on and above our ancestors, and that again is something I try to reverse, because I would say, if anything, especially uh, after reading about John S. Clarke and researching him, that the level of knowledge was really much, they were much more politicized and much more militant than I think people are today. So you had a whole leafleting system. So if you were, say, I don't know, a 14 or 15-year-old kid and you wanted to know more about the world, well, today, yes, you can look it up on the internet, but you're probably going to be distracted by all sorts of other things. But back in the day of John S. Clarke, there were some real histories of Scottish heroes and famous events and so on, and they were produced as cheap pamphlets. So there was a sense of knowledge, and the expectation of knowledge, perhaps, that isn't necessarily around today. And of course, also this segues into the Scottish culture, which is different to the English culture, and that's going to come through on with the Black Watch and so forth. So it's going to be quite an education for me personally. That's why I'm looking forward to the research. To find out more about how all this functions. Yeah.
Great. So I think I'd like to talk a little bit about the legacy of both Charlie's War and potentially Ragtime Soldier. Do you think the current political climate uh, that we have, that an anti-war comic is more relevant than ever.
Sadly, yeah, sadly. Um, I wish it wasn't. You know, when I finished Charlie's War originally, I thought, well, that's all done and dusted, and then somehow the clock's been turned back, and so yeah, it's actually more important now because when Charlie's War came out, uh, there were other anti-war things around. By comparison, there aren't anymore, and so it is very important.
Yeah, and finally, I suppose let's talk a little bit about, Ragtime Soldier itself. Where can we find out more information about it? How do we back it on Kickstarter if you're interested in that? I would say yes, but obviously I'm biased, and so are you, Pat. And kind of what comes next? What's the next chapter in this story potentially?
Well, once we know that we're going forward on this Kickstarter, and there are essentially three versions. There's the 48-page comic, and then there's the 48-page hardback, which would be, as it were, this. Um, and then there's the deluxe edition, which will have a cover and a ribbon and some other things, I think. So those are the three, and there's various add-ons and rewards which are listed on the Kickstarter site for Ragtime Soldier. So if you wanted to look at, for example, Gary's sketchbook, or if you're a budding writer and you want my opinion on your story, there's a category there if you want to go for that. And there's various other things along those lines. Where we go from here, as you can tell from the way I'm talking about the story, there's so much potential in it. There's no reason why it shouldn't last potentially as long as Charlie's War, because you've got this family drama going on as well. So there's an element of soap opera, if you like. So the two stories that come to mind immediately after this current one, which is about forced march, the first one I think would probably be Shell Shock, or would be certainly one of the ones. But I want the research I do on Shell Shock to be fairly original, or to have some new angles on it, good and bad. I used to live in a military town, Colchester, so I'm aware of the significance of shell shock. Young soldiers coming back from, back then it would have been Afghanistan and so on. So I'm looking for some of the new angles on it, as well as, and of course we also covered this back in the day in Charlie's War. There's this memorable scene of where actually their system, it sounds a bit crazy, where he's just sees these coloured lights spin round and round, and it's meant to soothe his brain and so forth. Although I suspect it probably had probably didn't do him much good. But they were working with the technology that they had at the time, and so it's fair enough. It's what they had to do. There we are. There's a colour version of it, which I think is rather more, brings it to life more. So what I'm interested in is what sort of systems did they use for shell shock, or what we would now call PTSD, and did it work? And what else did they interact with it. I have a feeling it's not actually that much better today, except that they have heavier drugs to subdue, mask the symptoms of shell shock. And I say that having talked to some Falklands veterans. But I'd like to I really want to research it and see. I know, for example, that there are claims for, I think it's called EMDR, which is rapid eye movement, which is meant to have a curative effect. I think the harsh reality is that trauma is trauma, and arguably it's a bit better than it was. But I want to explore that in Ragtime Soldier. So that's an important one. And also another one is the Irish connection, because as you'll doubtless know, there was a very strong Irish population in Dundee. And just after the war, there was lots of tension, if you like, between those who supported the Republic, those who were against the treaty, and then you had the whole Black and Tans era. And of course, Captain Pollard was at the forefront of this. So he's absolutely, and he had, which is surprising considering he was a devout Catholic, he had a deep hatred for the Irish, which is some of it's actually unprintable, but he wrote a book about it. He wrote a book about Irish secret societies. So he's going to be a very good villain in that one. And but I want exploring those tensions because, again, it's played down even in Irish histories. But I know this stuff went on. That when the Easter Rising happened, the Germans had all these signs on their side saying, "Are you listening, Irishmen? You know, you watching this? That you know, your countrymen have been put down by the soldiers of the British Empire, etc., etc." And there were Irish deserters who said, "I can't do this. You know, I can't stay." Whereas equally, there were others who said, "No, I've sworn an oath of loyalty to the British flag," and therefore, so all that creates great drama. So if one of my characters, one of my core group of ragtime soldiers, inevitably one of them has to be Irish, and so you kind of will get that story playing out. What was it like for him to be torn apart? And it doesn't just end with the end of the war. If you deserted, where do you go from there? And where did you go to? Did you go to Dundee? Did you go back to Ireland? And so there's a lot of good material there for drama. So I'm looking forward to seeing how that plays out.
That's great, Pat. Thanks very much for your time. I think it's a really fascinating insight, and I'm obviously like part of the team, but I would recommend people to back Ragtime Soldier. I think it's an important story, and I hope that other people resonate with that as well. So thanks very much, Pat.
Thank you, and well, I hope your viewers hope they go for Ragtime, and I'm sure they won't be disappointed. Okay.
Thanks.